Well, I think there are several things you have to remember. First, all these platforms are not they're not the same, and the networks that these platforms are on are not the same either. It's incorrect to assume that like MySpace and Facebook are similar, identical products competing. They're not. They are actually very different products that appeal to different audiences. MySpace is far more of a self-expression platform, and Facebook is far more of a communication platform. So the same game, or actually even in a broader sense, the same product is not necessarily going to do as well on each of these platforms because they are different, not just in functionality, but in terms of like the underlying user experience that a MySpace user expects as well as a Facebook user. So that being said, I think that the combination of these are not the same platforms in terms of functionality and also like expectation from the users. You need to be prepared if you're interested in porting. You need to be prepared to have not just a fair amount of technical work, but also potentially design work in terms of making your game more appropriate for each of these platforms. So the large question I think that everyone needs to ask themselves is what type of resources do they have? How much can they devote to each of these? It's always going to be work. There's no write once, run everywhere. There's write once and run most everywhere, but you do have to do some work, or you do have to do some things. Open social is great, but you will, even as you add another like open social network to your production line, there will be some amount of work. I think another thing that you need to keep in mind is that these networks don't have the same audiences. Some of these networks have audiences that are, like for example, Bebo is huge in the UK. So as you can imagine, there are opportunities to create games that, or not just games, but products that are, I guess, catered a little bit better to those audiences. One of the things that I learned that was really interesting, and I don't completely understand yet still, even after speaking to several British customers, the werewolf game was significantly more popular than the vampire game in the UK, whereas in America that was reversed. So I don't know why the werewolf myth is necessarily more popular in the UK, but as far as I can tell, all my stats, all my numbers consistently prove that. So there are things like that came up that I was very surprised, just because I'm like, oh yeah, the vampire myth is more popular than the werewolf myth, and I assumed that was universal, but it is, at least in my experience, that is not the case. I wish I had had a good eye for, or a good feel for how much support and maintenance time was going to go into each one of the platforms. It's very it varies month to month, and of course these are all new, although I guess I came in very early for most of them, so there was really no one with that experience to tell me and say, hey, you're going to be spending this much time supporting this platform versus this much time supporting that one. That would have been great to know, because then I could have made the judgment calls about, is this one worth the work? I did not see that much of a difference. There are, consistently you do see things like, I say you see things. Consistently, my understanding has been, from talking to many other game developers, that MySpace virtual goods, I guess, are a little bit more popular in their games when they have, pretty much the same game ported over identically. But I don't know the extent of that. I don't know, what their numbers are and that sort of thing. My own experience was I didn't see huge differences, and so it wasn't clear for me to necessarily say, oh, this network monetizes better than any other one. So I wasn't able to necessarily make those declarations. Now, when I do look at numbers, I tend to look at the numbers as divided up by very strong demographics, or I'm sorry, by geographic locations. So I didn't see Americans on MySpace behaving differently in terms of virtual good purchases than Americans on Facebook. Now, obviously, for networks that are primarily, like if you were to do High Five is not primarily U.S. audience, you can't necessarily expect if a particular geography has a different amount of disposable income, you can't necessarily expect them to spend the same amount of money on virtual goods and that sort of thing. So I tend to, slice people up based on geography, and I didn't see huge differences in the virtual goods spending. So virality is not identical on each of these networks. Each of these platforms has different opportunities and different channels, and some of them that have the same channels, from a very from a first perception, they may have the same channels. Those channels may not be as successful across different networks. So what you're going to have to do is on each one of them, you are going to have to think about each one of these channels. You have to think about each one of these networks and each one of these channels on each network, because it's not the same. It's not identical. You're not going to see the exact same success in every situation. So I think that a lot of people definitely underestimate the amount of work that's going to have to go into that. They say, oh, we got compatibility here. We're going to have compatibility there too, and that'll be done. It's not just a compatibility issue. There are differences in those channels that, if you really want to optimize for each one, it takes a certain amount of work. And certainly certainly a lot of people aren't going to have the resources to devote fully to each one of these. So, you have to prioritize, and you have to, it may be that you have to only support a fewer number of these networks or these platforms.